I want to thank today the millions of people who work for us, all while being exposed on the front line of the pandemic. They keep providing us with what we need to stay alive, and they support the interconnections that we need during this time of separation physically. And this was something that I thought about after watching a short public service announcement called Austin, Texas, March 20 to 23rd, 2020. This was a short film sent to me by Carolyn Parker, a friend from the Austin Ethical Society, who's also chair of the Ethical Action Committee of the American Ethical Union, on which I serve. And the video begins with lonely music and scenes of nearly deserted streets of Austin just after the pandemic struck. It brought to my heart a gentle loneliness that many of us have experienced, a sadness over the loss of connection, of missed hugs with relatives, of canceled conversations over coffee with friends. We miss each other. Halfway through that video, the melancholy begins to give way to signs of hope, images of encouraging slogans posted on billboards or spray painted on boarded up businesses. Stay safe. Stay home. We love you, Austin. Overcome. Then the following words came to the screen. When you see empty streets, the empty stadiums, the empty train platforms, don't say to yourself, it looks like the end of the world. What you're seeing in that negative space is how much we do care for each other, for our grandparents, for our immunocompromised brothers and sisters, for people we will never meet. People will lose their jobs, some will lose their businesses, and some will lose their lives. Take a moment to look into the emptiness and marvel at all that love. Let it fill you and sustain you. It isn't the end of the world. It's the most remarkable act of global solidarity we may ever witness. I loved how that video turned emptiness on its head, portraying isolation as an expression of civic connection, social responsibility, and love. That video eased my loneliness and emphasized the web of interconnection that may be stretched right now, but it isn't broken. And similarly, our empty ethical society building is a sign of how much we care about each other. That feels good. Similarly, as the pandemic began, it felt good to give shout outs to those working in healthcare or at food processing plants who were suddenly in danger so that we could be cared for and fed so that our connections would not be broken. We enjoy feeling gratitude. Back in 1911, Percival Chubb, leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, explained that, quote, gratitude is a form of joy, a high form of joy, because it's social in its reference. It is the outflow towards others of a generous gladness and fullness of happy life. Gratitude has the therapeutic value of wholesome joy, a cleansing value. It helps to liberate, to purify, and intensify the sediment of thankfulness so that it may irrigate the dry soil of our lives to new fruitfulness of beneficent action. Chubb also encouraged us to let gratitude flow from the overcharged heart as freely as the song of the bird flows forth to heighten the gladness of springtide. Now, back in the early weeks of disrupted schedules and empty sidewalks, when plans were on hold and psyches were in shock, I particularly embraced gratitude and emotional interrelatedness. I needed to. But in time, a new pattern emerged. Those fortunate enough to be able to work at home and settled in for the long haul, while those who drove buses or stocked grocery shelves adapted to a constant potential of exposure to COVID. Every day they confronted uncertainty and fear and frustration over their situation. Now, as an attempt at compensation, we dialed up our hero worship. Without sufficient information or protection or space, overwhelmed doctors, nurses, and medical technicians were lavished with praise. And some may have liked the applause, but I think they'd rather have had more concrete support. One nurse, Cecilia Yap Banango, raised the alarm over a lack of personal protective equipment, PPE, at a medical center where she worked for 4 decades before COVID took her life. Some nurses at St. Mary's Hospital up in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, after they struck because they were demanding more PPE and paid leave, some were fired. So much for hero worship, right? Lori Halbrook, a New Orleans nurse, was worried about her family. She said, look, her husband and her young children didn't sign up to get sick. So when she comes back from work, she, quote, I treat myself like I'm contaminated. Get out of my COVID clothes, put them in the wash, get into the shower, leave shoes on the porch, put them in a bag, spray them down. She says, I'm not wearing eye makeup anymore. I don't want to touch my face in any way. If I have a runny nose, I just let the snot run down. Or if you cry, you just let those tears roll. Such tears and sacrifice led New Yorkers to come to their front porch or lean out of their apartment window at 7 o'clock every night to bang on pots and pans in collective praise of dedicated health workers. But who did that ritual most serve, I wondered? The health workers or the rest of us who might have felt a bit guilty about remaining safe at home? It kind of reminded me of what we do at wartime when we march young people off to war. We wave flags and blast patriotic music. Who was that for? Them or us? Almost predictably, in our war against COVID right now, patriotism in the form of military jets joined in our expressions of gratitude. In April, Navy's Blue Angels and the Air Force Thunderbirds soared over New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, in what Air Force Lieutenant Colonel John Caldwell called a nationwide tribute to the men and women keeping our communities safe. Now, I'll admit that jets in tight formation soaring overhead are thrilling. But again, who was it for? Those on the front line or those with guilty consciences safe at home? I think frontline workers would have preferred the $60,000 an hour those flyovers cost to be spent on more protective equipment. Kim Kelly, a writer for the Washington Post, centered this question in an article entitled, Essential Workers Don't Need Our Praise, They Need Our Help. Kelly explained that, quote, as pretty as a picture as those exorbitantly priced fossil fuel burning imperialist war machines may have painted in the sky that day, one can safely assume that the workers they had been dispatched to celebrate would have been far more excited, say, about a raise or an announcement that the Defense Production Act was being used to ramp up PPE manufacturing. Even a few bottles of hand sanitizer would have gone a long way. And Kelly concluded, calling essential workers heroes makes it easier to pretend that they signed up to sacrifice themselves for the rest of us. So I wonder, does calling them heroes make their deaths seem more necessary, more acceptable? Soon, displays of gratitude were aimed at a longer list of essential workers, workers who previously got little public recognition. Grocery clerks, bus drivers, sanitation workers were now called heroes. Was that a hollow honor? Would workers agree with Kelly when he wrote that calling them heroes allowed those of us who are unlike them, privileged enough to remain home, to imagine that these workers agreed to serve as human sacrifices? That there's an inherent nobility in the risks they're taking? Kelly said that it gives us a chance to ignore the rotten, hazardous condition that have been allowed to fester thanks to capitalist cruelty and federal malfeasance, end quote. Carly Brogan of The Atlantic wrote that the hero is a pernicious label perpetrated by those who wish to gain something, money, goods, a clean conscience. These workers aren't heroes, they're victims who would prefer to trade places with you if they could. I mean, before the pandemic, a lot of these Workers were paid very little and they were generally ignored. I mean, take grocery store clerks that I admit I took for granted before the pandemic. Thanks to online ordering and curbside pickup, I only see them now when they fill my car trunk with food. They appreciate the tip I give them, but again, does that tip make me feel a little less bad about the privilege I enjoy staying safe at home while they go back into the stockroom? These workers need their paycheck. They appreciate the tips, but they actually have very little power in the workplace. Their choices are limited. Listen to how one grocery clerk described a hastily called meeting in the early days of the pandemic. Once we were all gathered in the back, seated on overturned milk crates, my boss removed a folded up piece of paper from his pocket and began to read a letter from our company's management that thanked us, presumptively, for our confidence and steadiness, and offered us the store a bonus. He quoted a customer who called our efforts a lifeline. Before the close of the meeting, my boss led us in a round of applause for our own hard work and dauntlessness. Though I clapped, something didn't sit right for me. Unlike medical personnel and emergency workers, we didn't sign up for potentially life-threatening work. We can't check the temperature of people entering our store or maintain a safe distance from one another. At the time that memo was read, we were discouraged from wearing masks because their efficacy against coronavirus was undetermined. I felt this advice had more to do with optics. Consumers wouldn't feel comfortable coming into our store if it looked like the inside of an operating theater, end quote. And with that, the cashiers and shelf stockers went back to work as the doors were open to customers, often too scared to think about those who served them. Early on, the hoarding of disinfectant and toilet paper led to arguments in the aisles, and when shoppers were asked to wear masks, some became righteous defenders of individual liberty and cursed out employees just trying to carry out corporate policy and trying to stay safe. 22-year-old Food Town clerk Darian Polito spoke about watching online videos of angry customers. He said, "We point and laugh. Look at that crazy woman, that poor cashier. But then that poor cashier turns into you." Another 20-year-old, Jacob Strike, who worked at Kroger's, complained that customers rarely respected the workers. The fact that the plexiglass shield at his counter was missing for months made angry conversations even more anxiety-filled. And as weeks turned into months, hazard pay was discontinued. Early efforts at contact tracing were scrapped. Paid emergency leave was no more. Meat packers were declared essential by Trump, but given little protection. I mean, processing plants are notorious for poor working conditions, and they became super spreader sites. At one Colorado plant, workers died one after one. Saul Sanchez, Eduardo Conchas de la Cruz, Tibocirio Rivera Lopez, all left their families grieving and without income. In Philadelphia, meatpacking worker and union leader Enoch Benjamin, a 70-year-old Haitian immigrant and an American success story, also succumbed to the virus. The federal agency responsible for worker protection, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, did little. It was reported that out of 5,000 worker safety complaints filed since the beginning of the pandemic, there was only one citation issued. State governments were even more overwhelmed because lower revenue due to the faltering economy made budget crises come and cutbacks in unemployment benefits. Nevertheless, in an attempt to get workers back to work, public transit workers were put at risk to keep commuters going. In Detroit, there was a viral video of a maskless commuter coughing away on the bus of Jason Hargrove, who died of COVID soon after. So died a 17-year-old veteran of SEPTA, the Philly transportation system, Yolanda Woodbury, leaving her husband David fuming over what he described as very little communication or sympathy from employers. We like to think that our mail carriers and our delivery drivers outside are safe on the sidewalks, but we don't think about the crowded sorting rooms throughout the US. And what about first responders, EMTs, firefighters, police officers who were thrust into hazardous environments every day. Sanitation workers were spotlighted during the pandemic because staffing shortages led to unsightly piles of garbage on streets, symbols of the staffing shortages. I mean, in my neighborhood, we never saw the trash pile up. Our little municipality of Tacoma Park kept its teams working, and I donated to a bonus that a neighbor collected for them. But again, I wondered, that bonus helped me feel better, but did it really protect them? Terrell Hagler, a Philadelphia sanitation worker, tired of being called a hero while being denied sufficient PPE and cleaning supplies, began using social media to raise funds. He created an Instagram account honoring all sanitation workers under the name Ya Fav Trash Man. In other words, your favorite trash man. He posted images of his work all day, including large piles of trash, in order to offer, quote, an inside look at the daily habits of a trash man. 21,000 followers signed up, and Hagler raised $32,000 for protective equipment. That's a nice story, but why was private funding needed to protect our municipal workers? Shouldn't we, the public, have provided them protection? And what about workers that are even considered more disposable than sanitation workers? Domestic employees like housekeepers. Usually they're not provided PPE equipment, and they're often the first to let go. According to the National Domestic Workers Alliance, nearly 40% of domestic workers have lost their jobs because of the pandemic. And since many of these workers are undocumented, they have no unemployment relief to keep their families fed. Maria del Carmen showed up at an empty Philadelphia house she's cleaned for years. It was empty, nobody was there. Only when she put the trash out did a neighbor tell her that the entire family had contracted COVID. The family didn't even inform her that she was working in a potentially contaminated space. She recalled, quote, I was terrified. I started crying. Then I went home, took off all my clothing, showered, got into bed. And for the next night and the next day, I waited for the coronavirus. She never got sick, but she's still angry. And there's a history of treating the help, as these human beings are often called, not as individuals, but as a faceless underclass. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that the average wage of 2.2 million domestic workers is a mere $12 an hour. This less than living wage often comes without benefits of Social Security or compensation for having to commute from distant neighborhoods because of our housing segregation in this country. Some of this disregard flows from historic sexism and historic racism. Sarah David Heidemann, a senior counsel at the National Women's Law Center, shared with me that some labor exploitation has roots in Jim Crow. She said that descendants of enslaved parents, powerless and exploited women, were often treated over the last century like the overworked but grateful mammies portrayed in films like Gone with the Wind. There was a 1912 article, she pointed out, about a woman identified as a Negro nurse, describing her 7-day-a-week, 14-hour-a-day work schedule as a treadmill life, because the measly $10 a month she got couldn't get her out of the trap of poverty. During the Great Depression, when Social Security began protecting workers, the federal government excluded two work categories: agricultural workers and domestic workers. Two categories disproportionately engaging people of color and women. In cities like New York, domestic workers would often gather around selected street corners with paper bags filled with work clothes in case they were lucky enough to get a day's worth of work. In 1935, reporter Marvel Cook and Ella Baker wrote a series of articles for the NAACP's publication The Crisis, describing such street corner labor pools as, quote, slave markets. The National Women's Law Center documents that government protections and union power are usually reserved for male industrial workers. In 1930, the trade journal The American City published an article about cost reductions, tactics used by employing minorities. in the worst jobs, ununionized workers. The article blandly explained, quote, colored women are used for this work. Many typical mammies are found there. So this sexist and racist legacy lives on. In 1950, the Daily Compass wrote, quote, that is the Bronx slave market where Negro women wait in rain or shine, in bitter cold or under broiling sun to be hired by local housewives looking for bargains in human labor. I can drive a mile away and I'll see a group of Latino men looking for manual labor on a day-to-day basis. This pattern of undervaluing work done by women and people of color and undocumented workers continues, especially in healthcare today during a pandemic, even before COVID struck. These workers and personal care assistants and home health aides earned less than $35,000 a year on average. And now more than 3/4 of healthcare workers fighting COVID in hospital, doctors' offices, residential care facilities are women, many of them Black women and Latinas. They've all lost their jobs at a higher rate than other groups during the pandemic. The Bureau of Labor Statistics indicated that this past December, losses of 140,000 hit women particularly hard. In fact, women lost 156,000 jobs, while men gained 16,000 jobs. If nothing else is clear in our new and uncertain world, we must do more than call those pandemic frontline workers heroes. We have to raise the bar and protect the dignity of labor. Many of you know that days before his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. used the phrase, the dignity of labor, when he addressed Memphis sanitation strikers. He preached that in this land of opportunity, we have to honor the integrity of working men and women. He said, you are demanding that this city of Memphis will respect the dignity of labor. So often we overlook the worth and significance of those not in professional jobs, who are not called into the so-called big jobs. But let me say tonight that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth. In our country, we often hold up dignity and worth as hallmarks of our country, and some of that's true. Kabir Singh, who produces a podcast called Poetic Philosophy, spoke about how much America differed from his native India regarding attitudes towards workers. In India, he explained, the caste system delineates which classes of people deserved respect and which could be exploited or ignored explicitly. He said when he hosts friends or family coming from India, he said that they were impressed with the degree of egalitarianism in the United States. But I think if this characteristic is to be real and deep and serving everybody, it has to manifest not just in slogans, but in both our personal relationships and in our public policy. The dignity and worth of every person is at the heart of ethical humanism. As an expression of our shared values, if we're to honor workers during the frightening pandemic, we need to do more than praise them. We need to support and empower them through equal access to government services and benefits and by facilitated collective bargaining. The federal government, most notably the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has to do its job and protect the safety and health of all workers. On local, county, and state levels, annual neighborhood tips aren't enough. Workers have to have power, and that power comes in the form of unions, like the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. The pandemic has pushed a younger generation of labor leaders, like Ernest Garrett, who was just elected president of AFSCME District Council 33, who are demanding that newly labeled essential workers like sanitation workers, correctional officers, and so forth get essential protective equipment. Instead of just feeling grateful, as good as that feels, let's support labor groups like Unite Here, fighting to help laid off airport, hotel, and stadium workers. Let's support the Coalition to Respect Every Worker. that helped push for a municipal Department of Labor in Philly, truly dedicated to labor protections. Support the Philadelphia Domestic Workers Alliance or One Pennsylvania or Power, all working to get thousands of workers additional relief funds. Before I conclude, let me just read one passage from Scientific American. Quote, "Professed philanthropy is often very cheap and common commodity. There is an exceedingly plentiful amount of wordy sympathy at present for working people. Hence, great swelling articles about the dignity of labor are paraded with extraordinary frequency and in prolific abundance." That article was published on July 2nd, 1853. Throughout our history, we've been alternating between praising and pitying workers doing the hardest work for the least pay in the most hazardous conditions. To say thank you, why don't we give them power? As Representative Ayanna Pressley puts it, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. Maybe this pandemic helped renew gratitude for the interconnected web of workers that hold us together. Today, support for unions has risen to 65%, higher than it's been for nearly 2 decades. Let's push that higher. And for those without unions, like domestic workers, let's demand legal protections. We need something like a Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, introduced last summer by our now Vice President Harris. It proposed higher minimum wage, overtime, and protection from racial discrimination. Pramila Nadasen, author of Household Workers Unite, explains, "The imbalance of power between employer and employer has been magnified by the pandemic because millions of people are now looking for work, and xenophobic rhetoric has made women more fearful of being deported." Well, a new administration offers us the chance to go beyond hero worship. Let's express real gratitude by giving workers protection and power. If we do that, we can say thank you and mean it. Thanks for being here today.